The U.S. Combating Global Corruption Act was designed to strengthen the U.S. government's hand in combating corruption abroad. For the first time ever, it required the State Department to evaluate and categorize foreign governments based on their anti corruption efforts, and then tie those efforts to things like foreign assistance and sanctions. This month, the statute reaches a critical inflection point. We are currently waiting on the first ever State Department rankings that are expected to be released later this month. But this rollout comes at a moment of deep tension in the United States. Even as the US positions itself as this global judge of corruption, it is simultaneously, as we've been tracking very closely here at Just Security, weakening and dismantling some of its key anti-corruption safeguards. This raises a key question. What does it mean for the United States to sit in judgment of other countries while its own systems are under strain? This is the Just Security Podcast. I'm your host, Dani Schulkin. Today's guests are Skye Miller and Adam Keith. Skye was a career civil servant in the U.S. State Department, where he served as a policy advisor for the Coordinator on Global Anti-Corruption and worked on the early implementation of the Combating Global Corruption Act before separating in a reduction in force under the Trump administration. Adam is a senior director for accountability at Human Rights First. He worked for the U.S. State Department as a career civil servant from 2007 to 2017, including for the now abolished Office of Global Criminal Justice. And we had the pleasure of publishing their article on global corruption and local hypocrisy, the promises and pitfalls of the U.S. Combating Global Corruption Act for Just Security earlier this month as part of our regular When Guardrails Erode series. So Skye and Adam, thank you for being on here today. I just want to kind of lay the groundwork at first on this issue. Partly because corruption can sound quite abstract and sometimes even technocratic, but as we all know, it has real consequences for our governance, for our national security, for our democracy, certainly. So before we get into the weeds of the statute, can you walk us through why corruption is a central concern, particularly for U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, thanks so much for having us, Dani. As you alluded to in your question, there's been, I think, a fairly bipartisan concern with the issue of corruption as a matter of foreign policy for last several decades. In the last decade, I think it built on this concern with good government at home and abroad that came out of the Watergate era and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and a recognition that this is an issue that affects our foreign policy, that affects American citizens. And so to varying extents and in different ways, you see the U.S. government's recognize this issue has several consequences, right, for our interests abroad, for American citizens. And so, this includes economic development, right, the ability for our businesses to compete on a level playing field and have sort of more certainty in their business transactions, political stability, the functioning of democratic government, right, its ability to deliver. Security, right? That includes military security and sort of components related to terrorists, for example, and the way that they can use corruption to fund their activities and advance their interests. And then civilian security and law enforcement, right? You see this, across administrations, a focus on drug trafficking, cartels, human trafficking, and the ways that corruption can be a grease for those activities, right? And can really lead to direct effects on American citizens, for example, on drug issues among many. And you see this borne out, I think, in specific cases, whether it's economic development in Africa and Asia, it's migration, again, drug trafficking in the Western Hemisphere, strategic corruption out of the Kremlin, for example, right, using corruption to advance their particular interests, where they're engaging in activity in foreign countries and using corruption to advance their interests. So really, I think across the board, seeing the way in which corruption should be and has been in many senses a focus for us on foreign policy. And this is why the U.S. government's undertaken several efforts in this area, in the last decade across administrations, right, including the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, whether it's diplomatic engagement, foreign assistance, sanctions, law enforcement, enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and other laws, really a key issue that we have to grapple with, and a key reason why Congress took this action that we're going to talk about today with the Combating Global Corruption Act.
Yeah, so, that unanimous or bipartisan support has been a really interesting part of this act as I've followed along. And I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about that. I noticed, from your piece, you mentioned that then Senator Marco Rubio supported the act when it was coming through the committee. What was Congress thinking at the time when it passed this act? What was it actually trying to do? What kinds of gaps was it trying to fill?
I can take that one. Thanks, Dani. I think so. The act was passed in, I think, late 2023. I think different versions of the Combating Global Corruption Act had been in circulation going back a few years. I think as early as 2017. So I think coming off of the Congress's success, I think Senator Ben Cardin and some other champions on these issues, after they had successfully gotten the Global Magnitsky Act passed, which was a mandate for the executive branch to use targeted sanctions against abusive or corrupt actors. I think part of what they saw being missing was a more consistent effort from the executive branch to spotlight corruption consistently when it's happening, and link those assessments of corruption to policy consequences, and hence the appeal of a kind of framework that would require that. And I think we can talk about this later, and we cover it in the article. There are already a lot of congressionally mandated reporting requirements along these lines, where Congress tells the executive branch it needs to produce reports on human rights conditions in countries around the world, on trafficking in persons, on international religious freedom, on investment climate. So I think the appeal to Congress was of applying that model of reporting and scrutiny to anti-corruption, and so that's what this act in its initial form, and still as it was enacted, just in a different way, I think tries to do, linking assessments about corruption and anti-corruption efforts in different countries to actual policy consequences.
So that brings us kind of to the guts of the act itself. How does it actually work? How you just mentioned tying it to actual policy consequences, but what is it asking the executive branch to do? How does it actually tie those consequences together?
Yeah, I'll say as I was implementing this, I was deep in the weeds on all these different components. So happy to sort of go through what the law really entails. So, it's built around these two mandated reports on the status of certain countries with respect to the minimum standards articulated in the law. And the law is sort of asking us to assess against those minimum standards, us being the U.S. government. There's these minimum standards that cover issues such as criminalization of corruption, law enforcement, and prevention. And Congress outlined more specific criteria that the State Department could use in analyzing and determining adherence to these standards. So, a little bit more granular information on what prevention looks like, for example, or what kinds of laws you might want to have on the books as a country that's combating corruption. And importantly, this was tied to international standards on anti-corruption. So, out of the UN Convention Against Corruption, for example, or the Anti-Bribery Convention that the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that they essentially maintain and uphold. So really trying to have good assessment against those minimum standards. So a bit more on the two reports. The first report is looking at good performance. So essentially cases where governments are making or sustaining good progress. This is a public list of those governments with a justification for why they should be on that list. And that's really looking at the adherence to the standards. And we had understood that this was governments that were sustaining good performance sort of from year to year, right? Those that are doing well, and then those that are sort of making those steps in the right direction. And then the second report is the sort of on poor performance, right, or really sort of limited effort. So it's looking at governments that are making limited to no efforts, right, and no meaningful progress in countering corruption, or trying to sort of have different efforts to counter corruption. That list was designated to be classified by the law, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But really a sort of chance to sort of get into why those countries aren't making good progress. Then beyond the reports, the other components sort of link up with the reports. We see that the U.S. government's supposed to consider global Magnitsky sanctions for countries on the poor performance list, and then there has to be a report. I think it's within 120 days on essentially what sanctions came out of that process, right? So it's looking to sort of tie our sanctions regime to those determinations. Then you also see that the government has to identify points of contact, essentially leads at U.S. embassies, to coordinate whole of government efforts in the poor performance countries. So if a government's on that list, they need to have a POC designated, and then there's also requirement for appropriate training for those POCs. And the idea behind that was just to make sure that there's a concerted effort to either engage with the government or engage on the country to have improvements on corruption. And then there's also a requirement for the U.S. government to provide an annual classified briefing on anti-corruption efforts. So that would be led by the department, but ideally would draw on all that the U.S. government is doing out of the Treasury Department or Department of Justice, communicating what kind of progress there is.
So I want to just clarify one point based off of what you just said. You've mentioned poor performers and good performers. Can you actually say just a little bit more about what does a good performer look like? What does a poor performer look like?
Yeah. So that's really based off of the minimum standards in the law, and then as I mentioned briefly, the law outlines some factors that the State Department could use to assess whether countries are meeting those minimum standards. So I think the best performance would be governments that are really doing well on all the different minimum standards, right? And there is always corruption, right? Every government in the world faces issues of corruption, right, internally and with the private sector, and so it's not sort of perfection, right? But do you have the kind of requisite anti-corruption regime in place, right? And so the factors are looking at things like, do you have financial transparency and integrity? It's looking at, do you have, laws in the books to criminalize corruption? And then, for example, there's a bit that looks at significant corruption, right? And how do you treat public officials that engage in significant kind of grand levels, serious embezzlement, right? Or serious procurement corruption? Do you see cases where there's really good law enforcement against those individuals and sort of equal application of the law across the board, right? And then prevention, for example, right? So do you have good ethics requirements, financial disclosure, all of those kind of different sub-elements of the standards that get a country and a government in as best a place as possible to address corruption? Again, recognizing there's going to be cases that come out, but how is the government responding? Are they properly kind of covering the waterfront from prevention all the way through to criminalization and enforcement?
So I want to get back to this list again. So we've got the good performers who are doing things like having transparent financial records and transparency regimes and enforcement regimes against corruption. And we've got these poor performers. And in your piece, you mentioned that the statute was actually based on a different reporting requirement initially, the trafficking in persons reports. But there's a big substantial difference in this statute, which you mentioned already a little bit, which is the decision to keep these quote unquote poor performers classified. So the public won't see who those poor performers are. So can you walk us through a little bit of why Congress made that choice? What problem were they trying to solve or maybe avoid?
Yeah, so I can jump in here, and then Adam may have some thoughts on some of the cons of the decision making. So this had long been a topic of discussion within Congress and between Congress and the State Department since Senator Cardin started to push for the legislation. Historically, the department had expressed concerns that an all-inclusive sort of tiered ranking, like the Trafficking in Persons report, would be a concern for a few reasons. And so they articulated sort of this concern that it would undermine our efforts to build an international sort of community, international framework for anti-corruption, right? So you have the UN Convention Against Corruption, you have some of the regional standards, and those standards have peer review mechanisms where governments are reviewing one another on the standards, right? So this would sort of go potentially a little bit against that, right? Or sort of be a second track, and the concern that we would be potentially undermining those standards if we're prognosticating ourselves, right? So that was one concern. Second was this position that we don't want to be a sort of judge on the issues, right? Given the concerns domestically, and I think there, and Adam may get into this, right? This is where maybe if we had some element of being able to assess ourselves, right? Like the TIP report has a self-evaluation that could potentially address it, but that was a concern, right? It wasn't sort of the main concern, and then there was, I think, a concern that the sort of all-inclusive list approach would remove the discretion for the department to be able to kind of strategically discuss specific concerns with countries that are making maybe making progress but aren't quite at that good progress level. And this is sort of a classic prioritization of sort of the bilateral relationship, but even separate from other priorities that you might have on bilateral foreign policy. I think there was a concern that if you're sort of coming out and just saying you're really bad, that it could jeopardize progress, right? And so there's a way in which the law was structured such that you're still sort of criticizing by omission governments by not having them on the good progress list, but you're not sort of actively saying here are the worst of the worst. And again, there are sort of pros and cons to that. So I'll just say, building on sort of that years of back and forth, the first coordinator on global anti-corruption, Richard Nephew, who I worked for, engaged with Congress to help inform the congressional negotiations and the outcome, the final act. And the goal really was to sort of focus on the sort of race to the top, focus on that good progress component, have that discretion, but really be able to signal by omission the governments that that the U.S. government had concern with, and then give discretion to the department in what they're able to share and what they keep classified.
I think I would just add to that. I mean, I think the State Department generally dislikes this kind of reporting requirement and will oppose it as much as it can. And I think the final text of the act is the product of these negotiations with the State Department. I think the cynical view that you'll hear from a lot of senior senators on foreign relations is that the State Department will fight these requirements right up until they're made into law, at which point they will begin proudly announcing that they've released the report on this topic and point to all of the impacts that it's had. So I think a lot of senators are prepared to disregard and push through that kind of resistance from a state. I think the compromise here being a sort of a classified poor performers list, I would speak to the downsides of that. I think the way that some of these reporting requirements work in other contexts depends on the public criticism. I think the key way in which the Trafficking in Persons reports have been shown to work is through this combination of public scrutiny, like the existence of a public evaluation that's either good or bad, that's quantified or easily understood in some way, and that involves comparison to their peers, which again, in the Trafficking in Persons context, it's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, that the third being the worst. has been shown to produce specific reforms in the countries being covered. Spurring the criminalization of trafficking, spurring increases in prosecutions. So I think the concern about this approach that I have, at least, is that keeping the poor performers list classified doesn't have that. I think Senator Cardin's staff were pretty clear that they saw this version of the act as potentially being a step toward that. It's the trafficking in persons reporting requirement has been developing for years, changing from year to year as Congress sees what the reports look like and what impact they're having. So I think the imperative in the current cycle is to see what comes out and for advocates to get as much as they can out of the current framework. But I think the fact that outside observers who aren't in Congress, who aren't getting the classified list, are going to have to divine from who's not on the good performers list, who is in fact on the poor performers list, I think is going to be less impactful. And it certainly doesn't help challenge the sort of selectivity problem where the executive branch is much less likely to criticize corruption or abuses, human rights abuses by its friends than those that are carried out by adversary governments.
Yeah, there does seem to be a few ways to divine who's on the poor performers list. Maybe it's by omission, but also kind of getting back to the individual sanctions, which are often made public in some capacity, whether it's on the Treasury Department's list. Can you walk us through a little bit more about these individual sanctions? So sanctioning not a country for its poor performance, but an individual who resides within that country, which is, a novel part, as you mentioned, of this statute. What's the goal of having individual sanctions? What is it designed to do?
Sure. So I think they're designed to do a number of things, and what they actually do when they're used depends kind of inevitably on the context. So the specific sanctions program that the Combating Global Corruption Act is trying to tap into and trigger is the Global Magnitsky program, which is a Treasury Department-led sanctions program that entails financial penalties and a visa, an entry ban for individuals or companies that are engaged in serious human rights abuse or corruption. And I think the novelty of that sanctions program is that it's available not just in like crisis countries or adversary countries where the U.S. had historically created sanctions programs, but anywhere in the world. And that's important and useful because corruption happens everywhere in the world. And I think to point to some examples, there have been a number of, I think, impactful targeted sanctions. We often point to cases that include a Ukrainian judge who was notoriously, allegedly corrupt, and the U.S., the Biden administration publicly announced a visa ban on him in 2022, and that action spurred the Ukrainian parliament, after many years of advocacy by Ukrainian civil society, to, I think, belatedly reform the court that this judge was in charge of. We have seen a case from the first Trump administration where a Latvian official who was allegedly corrupt and had control over a major port facility was sanctioned by the Trump administration, which prompted the Latvian authorities, I think, belatedly, to take this guy out of his position of control over that port, which led the Trump administration to then lift the sanctions on the port. So I think changing behavior like that or spurring action by national authorities is one of the best kinds of impacts that these sanctions have, and that we see most often in the context of like a friendly relationship between the U.S. and other countries. Sanctions can also serve like defensive or protective purposes in any context. I think no one expects Russia to prosecute one of its oligarchs when they're put on the sanctions list, but having them on the Treasury list can prevent Americans from transacting with them. So again, I think the novelty of the Combating Global Corruption Act is to create this linkage, or try to create a linkage between the U.S.'s hopefully objective, credible assessment about whether a country is genuinely trying to combat corruption, and if not, the need to consider targeted sanctions on specific officials in that country who are presumably part of the problem. So if the assessments are credible, then that linkage can be a check on the selectivity problem that I talked about. But again, you're going to have to. It's going to fall a lot to Congress to make use of those connections, since it's the only one who's going to see the poor performers list.
So you mentioned that keyword, credible. As we've been tracking very closely alongside my colleague Amy Markopoulos, in our anti-corruption tracker in this series, there's been a notable trend in the United States of removing at least historic anti-corruption guardrails, whether that's the enforcement units at DOJ that no longer exist, the FOIA units that aren't staffed as they once were, inspector generals, for example, that are no longer as empowered or in place. And so there's this central irony that you tease out in your piece really well, where the U.S. is being asked to judge all these countries when at the same time its own safeguards are or may be weakening. So can you walk us through this credibility challenge? Why does this? I mean, it might sound obvious, but I think it's worth expounding on. Why does credibility matter for a report like this?
Sure, I could start. I mean, especially I think people who are not immersed in the State Department world or Washington. I mean, this may be the most obvious thing that comes up. I think the thing that I think motivated our article in the first place was this evident and growing gulf between the Trump administration's actions and the standards and factors that the Combating Global Corruption Act sets out for other countries. Our article has a sort of abbreviated illustrative list of things that the law says other countries should do and that the Trump administration itself has stopped doing or reduced the extent to which it's doing. The impact that these reports have when the U.S. puts out its assessment, whatever the topic, I think is partly based on, the information they contain. The U.S. has a worldwide network of embassies that can dig into these issues and tap into a lot of sources. But a lot of their impact, I think, depends on the sort of minimum level of credibility that the U.S. has as a speaker or an actor on those issues. And in the anti-corruption space, it's actually it has been a pretty promising field. Like the U.S., Sky pointed out, the U.S. has ratified the major anti-corruption treaties in a way that is not the case in the human rights sphere, where there are a lot of major treaties where the U.S. is an outlier and hasn't ratified. But that makes it all the more painful to have, as the first year of the second Trump term has played out, to see the Act's criteria serving almost as a checklist of things that the U.S. has stopped doing. So I am hopeful that what the reports contain, that there is still content there for advocates that to make use of in their own country if the U.S. is usefully praising initiatives that that advocates can try to sustain and keep going, and hoping that Congress at least will use what it has to follow up on the classified criticism. But I think most importantly is for Congress to use this as a chance to scrutinize the U.S.'s own record on these criteria that it laid out for other countries to follow.
So, Sky, go for it.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think we just had concerns that again, given all these issues, the U.S. government would not be able to sort of engage effectively with foreign governments on the particulars when they can sort of come back and point to, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, and of course. I think I can speak for Adam, and I'd say we don't expect any country, including the U.S. government, to be perfect on all these issues, right? And some of the other areas, human rights, trafficking in persons, we have our own issues, right? And we've been working to address them in some instances and not in others. But I think it's the sort of wholesale concern that it's not being taken seriously domestically, that it's not a priority, that in some cases, as you highlighted, Dani and Adam as well, we've seen that backsliding, right? Is how can we then go to other countries and say, you need to make progress on X, Y, and Z issue when we're not even trying, or at least it doesn't seem like there's an effort, there's, minimal policy communication, you see the particulars of backsliding that really put into question the whole effort.
Yeah. So I think there's a big question of what do we do next? Looking ahead, you mentioned in your piece that political leaders and the public should and can do more to make the Act's mission actually be implementable. And so, in practice, what does that actually look like? How can the law essentially live up to its promise?
Yeah, so we went through 4 different recommendations. I'll go through the first 2, and Adam can highlight the next 2 and any other reflections. So the first was really starting with the reports themselves, scrutinizing the country selections, the justifications. Again, that's only the public list, right? Given our discussion that we don't have the poor performance list, no Congress will have the poor performance list. So we do call on Congress to scrutinize both lists, and really there we highlighted the concern around political pressure, right? That there could be political factors separate from anti-corruption determinations that influence which countries fall on which reports, right? Either in the positive direction or the negative direction. And so, spotting those kind of cases where you see some concerns, and we highlight in the piece where that happened in the human rights report that just came out. I think it was in August. So there's some precedent to be concerned about, and so looking at that again, sort of looking at whether the justifications are really adhering to the minimum standards in the law, right? Grounded in sort of the prevention and criminalization and enforcement. Are we seeing that kind of articulation? And then looking at things like does the public report talk at all about how the State Department resourced the issue, for example, since that was a sort of expectation in the methodology report that we submitted when I was at the State Department, that the U.S. government submitted to Congress. It was supposed to sort of articulate what the budget is, right? So do we see that kind of information in the report? And that resourcing is the staffing numbers for here in DC, out at embassies, right? What kind of analysis is what kind of time is being devoted to the analysis? Are there other kinds of expenses, for example, related to AI support for on these issues? So those are some things to look at there. And then, we also highlighted the need for Congress, for civil society to really look at the follow-up, right? So, again, what kind of sanctions, Adam talked about this earlier, what kind of sanctions do you see coming out of the report? Are there good kind of, is there an uptick in cases for countries that seem like they would be on that poor performance list? Are there POCs? That's not something that the public will have access to, the POC list, right? That's because if you knew the POCs, then you'd know the poor performance list, right? But Congress.
I'm going to butt in for a second. And a POC is a point of contact.
Sorry, point of contact.
The person at the embassy who's assigned to, any inquiries about the anti-corruption efforts.
Exactly. So, because each of the poor performance list countries, for the governments on that list, has to have that point of contact, right? Congress should be making sure that happens, right? That there is a good list, that those people are getting appropriate training, that it's not just a sort of check the box exercise, but that they are getting the tools that they need to actually lead a whole of government effort in that country, right? And sort of understand the issue and follow up on it. So things that we should see Congress and civil society and others tracking. So those are 2 areas that we outlined, and that Adam will jump in on the other 2.
I mean, a lot of the things that we're suggesting are kind of technocratic fixes, and I think you could imagine more of those to the act itself, right? Like this act is part of the legal framework for at least the next 6-7 years. You could imagine a version of the act that adopts the tiered ranking system and otherwise builds on this first year's report, depending on how they go. I think one improvement that Sky touched on would be, if this system continues, it would be to have a requirement for, as the trafficking in persons system has a requirement for the U.S. to self-scrutinize, for the administration to have to account for its own record on these criteria. At this moment, that would be especially painful to draft, potentially painful to read, but it would be a chance for, a specific thing for Congress to scrutinize. I think our last recommendation or set of thoughts tries to get beyond the sort of technocratic and focus on the political, right? Like, I think this administration just doesn't see anti-corruption as a priority, to put it mildly. And at that point, a lot of this just depends on public opinion. And I think here a lot falls on advocates and Congress in particular to make the case for how, corruption destabilizes democratic allies, sustains violent adversaries, goes hand in hand with human rights abuses, and has human impacts. I think this is an area that is ripe for leading members of Congress, if they can't get if they don't control the committee to put on a hearing, to have shadow hearings where, senators or Congress people would hear from people who are, companies who are less able to compete on a level playing field abroad because the U.S. is ratcheting back enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or people from states whose senators or members of Congress were themselves charged with corruption, convicted of corruption, and denied honest representation by their congressional representatives, and to hear from them about that experience, which I think would be especially kind of painful in context where the administration has come along and pardoned or dropped charges on spurious grounds against some of those officials. So, I think we tried to finish on this sort of like broader political lens where, tweaking the act and pressing the administration to follow, the requirements of the act in terms of sanctions or embassy contacts is important, can be useful. But in the end, I think a lot of this turns on what the public insists on. I think some of the best and most impactful anti-impunity initiatives for corruption have ultimately succumbed to pushback, often like very self-interested pushback by perpetrators. And, because the public didn't quite stick up for them enough when push came to shove. And I think in Ukraine, we've seen the opposite of that, where, a government that has certainly been better than its predecessors on corruption, the government in Ukraine, was proposing some reforms that would have weakened the independence of some of these anti-corruption bodies. And the public came out in numbers and said no, and, kept those institutions the way they were. I don't see that happening, people taking to the streets in the U.S. On quite the same set of issues. But I think, the extent to which the public feels that importance of an effective fight against corruption, I think will determine how impactful the U.S. is on this in the future.
Well, I guess we will find out. This report is supposed to be released, as I mentioned, by later this month. We'll see if it's released on time. But in the meantime, I want to thank you, Skye and Adam, for taking the time to walk us through this report, what its consequences are, and kind of situate in this global context of policing corruption, both here and abroad, and what that impact is. This episode was hosted by me, Dani Schulkin, and produced by Maya Neer with help from Isaac Rubenstein. Again, special thanks to you both, Skye Miller and Adam Keith. You can read Skye and Adam's article and the rest of the When Guardrails Erode series on Just Security, linked in this episode's show note. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.